Hello, ladies and gentlemen, lovers of history. You are watching History for Sleep. Tonight, we turn to a towering and controversial figure, someone who shaped the 13th century like few others. A man remembered by some as a symbol of enlightened rule, and by others as the embodiment of ruthless conquest. We will dive into the life of the grandson of Genghis Khan, the one who completed his grandfather's mission, but did so in a way that Genghis himself might never have imagined and perhaps never even desired. This is the story of Kublai Khan, the last great Khan of the United Mongol Empire and the first emperor of China's Yuan dynasty. If you enjoy this journey into history, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what topics you'd like to hear about in future episodes. I'd love to make a story just for you. To understand Kublai, we must first return to the origins, to the towering shadow of his colossal grandfather, Temujin, known to the world as Genghis Khan. The world into which Kublai was born in 1215 was a world already being overturned by his grandfather's ambition. Genghis Khan was a genius of war and organization, a man who, out of the fragmented and hostile tribes of the Mongolian steppe, forged a single nation and created the most effective military machine the world had ever seen. His empire was built on iron discipline, on the law of the Yasa, and on the concept of a heavenly mandate, granted by the eternal blue sky Tengri, that entrusted the Mongols with the right to rule the world. The philosophy of Genghis Khan was brutally simple. Submit, and you will live in peace under our protection. Resist, and you will be annihilated to the last man, your cities erased from the face of the earth. This was an empire born in fire and blood, held together by fear, and ruled from the saddle. Its capital, Karakorum, was less a city in the sense we understand the term than an immense camp of the steppe, center of nomadic rather than sedentary civilization. Kublai was the son of Tolui, the fourth son of Genghis Khan. According to Mongol tradition, the youngest son, called the Ochigin, the keeper of the hearth, inherited the father's lands in Mongolia. Tolui was a powerful and respected commander, but his early death in 1232, under rather mysterious circumstances, left his four sons, Monka, Kublai, Hulagu, and Arik Boka, under the care of their mother. And here we come to the first, and perhaps the most decisive factor that shaped the character of the future emperor, his mother, Sorghaghtani Beki. This woman was nothing less than a marvel of her age, a niece of Yuan Khan of the Karait, who had been defeated by Genghis Khan. She was a Nestorian Christian, highly educated, far-sighted, and an extraordinarily intelligent political figure. While many other widows of Khans engaged in intrigues for short-term power, Sorghaghtani thought in decades. She grasped what many Mongol princes could not. Raw military strength alone was insufficient to govern an empire that encompassed the most sophisticated sedentary civilizations. She insisted that her sons study not only the art of war, but also the principles of ruling conquered peoples. Thanks to her vision, the Toluids, the children of Tolui, became the most influential and best educated branch of the House of Genghis. It was Sorghaghtani who instilled in Kublai an enduring interest in other cultures, above all in the Chinese. Rashid al-Din, the great Persian historian at the court of Hulagu's descendants, later wrote of her, "If all women were like her, they would surpass men." Kublai grew up observing the vast expansion of the empire under his uncle Ogadai, the successor of Genghis Khan. He saw Mongol armies reach the Adriatic in the west and subdue Korea in the east. But he also saw the darker side. Ogadai and his court sank into luxury and drunkenness, and the administration of vast territories, especially northern China, was chaotic, often reduced to sheer plunder. Some Mongol hardliners even proposed exterminating the population of northern China and transforming its fertile farmlands into pastures for horses. This horrifying idea, fortunately, was rejected thanks to the wisdom of advisors such as Yelu Chukai. Yet the very fact that such a proposal was seriously discussed reveals the gulf in worldview between nomadic conquerors and their sedentary subjects. In 1236, in accordance with Mongol custom, Kublai, like other princes, was granted an appanage, a hereditary domain. He received extensive lands in what is now Hebei province in northern China, and this became for him a true school of governance. Unlike many of his relatives who treated their domains merely as sources of income, sending tax collectors to squeeze as much wealth as possible, Kublai showed a genuine and growing interest in administration. At first, however, due to inexperience, he allowed both local officials and Mongol collectors to plunder the population unchecked, which led to a mass flight of peasants. When his revenues collapsed, Kublai, acting on his mother's advice, began to investigate the causes. He surrounded himself with a circle of advisors drawn not only from Mongols, but also from Chinese, Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Persians. A key figure in this intellectual circle was the Buddhist monk Yuan, who introduced him to the principles of Buddhism and, more importantly, presented him to a brilliant scholar and administrator, Liu Bingzhong. Liu Bingzhong became for Kublai what Aristotle had been for Alexander the Great. He taught him the foundations of Confucian ethics, Chinese history, and, most crucially, the principles of humane governance rule, based on care for the people as the very source of the state's prosperity. Under Liu Bingzhong's guidance, Kublai carried out radical reforms in his appanage. He streamlined the tax system, replacing predatory levies with fixed taxation. He encouraged agriculture, launched public works, founded schools, and enticed runaway peasants back to their lands with promises of protection and stability. The results were extraordinary. His appanage began to flourish, turning into an island of order and prosperity in the middle of war-ravaged northern China. This experience forever changed Kublai. He became convinced in practice that the prosperity of subjects was more valuable than their total plunder, and that wise administration yielded greater fruit than brute force. He began to see himself not simply as a Mongol conqueror, but as a potential ruler of China itself, in the Chinese tradition, a true son of heaven. Meanwhile, in Karakoram, passions were boiling. After the death of Ogadai and a brief regency under his widow Turagan, the throne passed to Ogadai's son Guyuk. His reign was short, marked by conflict with the powerful Batu, Khan of the Golden Horde. Guyuk's early death in 1248 reopened the question of succession, and here Sorghaghtani Beki played her decisive game. Skillfully maneuvering and forging an alliance with Batu, she secured the election of her eldest son, Munka, as Great Khan at the Kurultai of 1251. It was a triumph for the House of Tolui. Munka Khan was capable and resolute, a supporter of traditional Mongol values but also aware of the necessity of order and governance. He launched a campaign against corruption, conducted an empire-wide census to regularize taxation, and set before himself two great objectives, goals already envisioned by Genghis Khan: the conquest of the remnants of the Abbasid Caliphate in the Middle East, and the final subjugation of the Southern Song, the wealthiest and most populous empire of the age. To carry out these tasks, Munka appointed his brothers. Hulagu, with a vast army, was sent westward on a campaign that would end with the fall of Baghdad and the founding of the Ilkhanate in Persia. Kublai, meanwhile, was entrusted with the war in China. His first target was not the Song dynasty itself, but the kingdom of Dali, located to its southwest in what is now Yunnan province. This campaign of 1253 to 1254 was of immense strategic importance. It allowed the Mongols to create a base for an assault on the southern Song from the west, bypassing the powerful fortifications along the Yangtze River. It was during this campaign that Kublai first demonstrated his new approach to war on the scale of an entire country. He led his army through difficult mountains and gorges, showing his talent as a commander. But most importantly, he issued a strict order. There was to be no senseless slaughter. Before the assault on the Dali capital, he is said to have made a silk banner with the inscription, "Surrender, and no one will be harmed." When the city fell, he forbade looting and killing. The ruler of Dali was pardoned and even allowed to continue governing the region as a vassal of the Mongols. This act of mercy was unheard of by the standards of Mongol conquest. Yet it was not simply goodwill, it was a pragmatic political decision. Kublai understood that he needed not ruins, but a prosperous and loyal province. He showed all of China that he was not merely another barbarian, but the bearer of a different constructive power. While Kublai consolidated his authority in northern China, built a new northern capital at Kaiping, later renamed Shangdu, the legendary Xanadu of Coleridge's poem, and acquired a reputation as an enlightened ruler, discontent was growing within the Mongol elite. Traditionalists in Karakoram looked with suspicion at his Sinicization. They were troubled by his closeness to Chinese advisors, his interest in Buddhism, and his administrative reforms, which seemed to them a departure from the legacy of Genghis Khan. They whispered to Munka that Kublai was creating a realm of his own, that he was too popular among the Chinese, and that he might one day challenge the authority of the great Khan. The tension reached a breaking point. In 1257, Munka, yielding to these accusations, sent investigators into Kublai's domain. Many of his officials were executed for corruption. It was a direct humiliation and challenge. Kublai stood at a crossroads. He could rise in rebellion, but instead, he chose the path of humility, dictated by Chinese wisdom. He sent his family as hostages to the capital and presented himself before Munka, demonstrating loyalty. Munka, who loved his brother, forgave him. Brotherly affection triumphed over political intrigue, but the storm clouds were gathering. In 1258, Munka Khan decided to personally lead the campaign against the Southern Song. He marched with a vast army but met fierce resistance. The Song forces, relying on a chain of strong fortresses in their fleet, defended themselves with extraordinary tenacity. The Mongol army, accustomed to mobile warfare on the steppes and plains, became bogged down in prolonged sieges under the hot and humid climate of southern China. And then, in August 1259, during the siege of Daoyu Fortress in Sichuan, came the event that would forever change the fate of the Mongol Empire and the entire world. Munka Khan died. The exact cause of his death remains disputed. Some say he fell to an arrow from the defenders, but more likely, he was the victim of an epidemic of dysentery or cholera that raged in the Mongol camp. The news of the Khan's death spread like wildfire across the empire. The death of a ruler meant one thing: a struggle for the throne. At that moment, the four key figures, the four sons of Sorgagtani, were scattered across Eurasia. Hulagu was fighting in Syria. Kublai was besieging the city of Ezhu on the Yangtze River, and their youngest brother, Arik Boka, remained in the Mongol capital Karakoram, acting as regent. Kublai was in a most difficult situation. He was conducting war in the very heart of enemy territory. Learning of Munka's death, he first intended to immediately march north into Mongolia to assert his claim to the throne, but his Chinese advisors persuaded him not to. A hasty retreat would look like flight and undermine his authority. Following their advice, Kublai carried out a brilliant maneuver. He crossed the Yangtze, demonstrating his military power, and then concluded a truce with the Song Chancellor Jia Sidao, who, fearing complete defeat, agreed to pay tribute. Securing for himself an honorable peace and protecting his rear, Kublai marched north, and he did not hurry in vain. His younger brother Arik Boka, in Karakoram, having secured the support of most of the Mongol princes from the old aristocracy, was already preparing to proclaim himself Great Khan. To them, Arik Boka was the perfect candidate, the defender of tradition, a true steppe nomad, a ruler who would govern from the ancestral Mongol capital, not from some Chinese city. He represented the past. Kublai represented the future, A future in which the Great Khan was not just the leader of nomads, but the emperor of the greatest sedentary civilization in the world. A future in which the center of power shifted from the dry steppes of Mongolia to the fertile plains of China. This was not merely a rivalry between two brothers, it was the clash of two worlds, two ideologies, two paths of development for the Mongol Empire. And upon the outcome of this struggle depended the fate of Asia for centuries to come. Thus began the civil war that split the empire of Genghis Khan and opened the way for the birth of a new, unprecedented power, the Yuan dynasty. So, we left off at the turning point at the end of 1259. Great Khan Mongku was dead. The Mongol Empire, like a gigantic ship that had suddenly lost its captain in a storm, was left without a rudder, and two men now laid claim to the captain's bridge, two brothers, two sons of the great Sorghaghtani Kublai, and Arik Boke. This was not a simple dispute over succession. It was an existential choice of path for the entire Mongol civilization. Arik Boke, the younger brother, was in the ideal position. He was in Karakoram, the heart of the ancestral Mongol lands. He was supported by most of the Mongol aristocracy, those who looked back with nostalgia to the times of Genghis Khan, those who saw Kublai's Sinicization as a betrayal of the forefathers' precepts. For them, the Yasa, the great law of Genghis, was inviolable, and the steppe the only possible center of the world. They believed in ruling from the saddle, not from a palace. In their eyes, Arik Boke was the guardian of tradition, a true Mongol. In the spring of 1260, he convened a Kurultai in Karakoram, at which the princes loyal to him proclaimed him Great Khan. From the standpoint of Mongol custom, this was a legitimate procedure. But Kublai was already playing by different rules. He understood that there was nothing for him to gain in Karakoram. There he would find himself in the minority, in the camp of his enemies. His strength was not in the Mongol steppe, but in the prosperous, densely populated, and wealthy northern China that he had transformed through his governance, and so he took a step that was unprecedented revolutionary. He convened his own Kurultai, not in Mongolia, but in his new capital, Kaiping, Shangdu. Those who gathered there were primarily people personally loyal to him, his generals, Mongol princes whose fiefs lay in China, and importantly, his numerous non-Mongol advisors, Chinese, Uyghur, and others. In April 1260, even before Arik Boke's assembly, this gathering proclaimed Kublai the Great Khan. For the first time, the world saw two great Khans of the Mongol Empire. The split was a fact. Civil war was inevitable. It was a war of resources and ideas. Arik Boke had on his side legitimacy in the eyes of traditionalists and control over the nation's heartland, Mongolia. Kublai, however, possessed the practically inexhaustible resources of China. He had grain, iron, gunpowder, artisan workshops, and most important, millions of taxpayers who could finance a long war. His bureaucratic apparatus, built on the Chinese model, was incomparably more effective than the archaic system of Arik Boke. Kublai immediately went on the offensive, and his principal weapon was the economy. He understood that the steppe could not feed itself. Its well-being had always depended on trade with neighboring agricultural civilizations, first and foremost with China. Kublai imposed the harshest blockade on Mongolia. He cut off shipments of grain, cloth, and other vital goods from south to north. He declared Arik Boke a usurper and ordered all appanages on Chinese territory to obey only him. For Arik Boke and his followers, this was a catastrophe. Famine began in the steppe. Loyalty grounded in tradition quickly melted away when bare survival was at stake. Kublai, by contrast, presented himself as a true ruler concerned with the population's welfare. Immediately after being proclaimed Khan, he chose a reign motto, Zhongtong, which can be rendered as central governance or balanced rule. It was an unmistakably Chinese gesture, a signal to all that he intended to rule as the emperor of the Middle Kingdom, ensuring order and stability. He reorganized the administration, established central ministries on the Chinese model, and even began issuing China's first paper money with unified circulation and strict backing. While Mongolia starved, his domains prospered. The war lasted 4 years, from 1260 to 1264. It was not only great battles, but also a chain of smaller clashes, betrayals, and shifting alliances. Arik Boka desperately tried to break the blockade. He secured the support of the Chagatai Ulus in Central Asia, but soon his own appointee, Khan Ulgu, betrayed him and began fighting for independence, weakening Arik Boka's camp even further. Kublai's armies, led by commanders loyal to him, gradually pushed Arik Boka's supporters out of all key regions. The climax came in 1264. Exhausted and abandoned by most of his followers, Arik Boki was forced to admit defeat. He came to Shangdu and stood before his elder brother. It was a scene worthy of a Shakespearean feast. The younger brother, the defender of the old ideals, bowed to the elder, who personified the new order. Kublai, as the chronicles relate, held a public judgment. He asked his own companions, who was right in our struggle, he or I? They, of course, answered in chorus, "You were right." Oh. But then he put the same question to Arik Boka's supporters, and they, showing courage, replied, "We believed that he, Arik, was right. Now, heaven will show who was truly right." Kublai showed magnanimity. He pardoned all of Arik Boka's partisans, but kept his brother by his side in honorable captivity. Arik Boka's fate was a sad one. 2 years later, in 1266, he died, and the circumstances of his death remained unclear. Many suspected he had been poisoned on Kublai's orders, who wished once and for all to be rid of a legitimate rival. There is no direct proof, yet this shadow remained upon Kublai's reputation. Victory in the civil war made Kublai the sole ruler. But it was a Pyrrhic victory for the idea of a united Mongol empire. The war had finally shattered the state of Genghis Khan. The Khans of the other Uluses, having watched the struggle between the two brothers, in effect gained full independence. The Golden Horde on the Volga, ruled by Khan Berk, was already a de facto independent state and in conflict with the Hulaguid line. The Chagatai Ulus in Central Asia plunged into chaos and internecine strife. Only Hulagu's Ulus become the Ilkhanate in Persia, formally recognized Kublai's supremacy as Great Khan. But even that was more an alliance than subordination. Hulagu and his descendants ruled their realm entirely on their own. The world empire of Genghis Khan, stretching from the Pacific to the Black Sea, ceased to exist as a single political whole. On its ruins arose 4 independent Mongol states. Kublai remained Great Khan, but his real power no longer extended beyond China, Mongolia, and some adjacent territories. He understood this perfectly, and since he could not rule the whole world from Karakoram, he resolved to become the greatest ruler of that part of the world which was under his hand. He decided to become the Emperor of China. The first step on this path was the construction of a new, truly imperial capital. Shangdu, his summer residence, was splendid, but lay too far to the north. Karakoram, ruined and depleted by civil war, was a symbol of the past from which Kublai wished to distance himself. He needed a capital situated at the center of his Chinese dominions, able to control both the agrarian south and the steppe north, and whose magnificence would eclipse everything that had been built before him. The site was chosen with brilliant foresight. Northeast of Zhongdu, the old capital of the Jurchen Jin dynasty, taken earlier by Genghis Khan, Kublai ordered a new city to be founded. The design was entrusted to his chief advisor, the architect and astronomer Liu Bingzhong, as well as the Arab architect Ikhtiar al-Din. It was a synthesis of Chinese and Muslim urban ideas. The city received the Mongol name Khanbalik, the city of the Kayan, known to Marco Polo as Kambalux, and the Chinese name Dadu, the great capital. Construction began in 1267 and proceeded on an astonishing scale. Dadu was a masterpiece of planning, a strict rectangle oriented to the cardinal directions, as Chinese canons prescribed. Wide, straight avenues crossed at right angles, dividing the city into wards. At its center stood a grand forbidden city, the palace complex where the emperor resided. Around it lay administrative buildings, temples, and markets. A powerful wall nearly 30 kilometers in perimeter, with 11 gates, enclosed the city. To provision the capital, the Grand Canal was repaired and extended, linking Dadu with the rich agricultural regions of the south. Dadu became not merely an administrative hub, but a melting pot of cultures. Mongols, Chinese, Persians, Arabs, Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Europeans lived there. Dozens of languages could be heard in its streets. Buddhist monasteries, Confucian temples, Muslim mosques, and Christian churches stood side by side. It was a cosmopolitan center of the world, a symbol of a new epoch. Moving the capital to Dadu was not just a change of address. It was a final and irreversible civilizational shift. The center of power in the Mongol world moved from the Mongol steppe into the heart of China. And to complete this transformation, Kublai had one last symbolic step to take. In 1271, he issued an edict officially proclaiming the foundation of a new dynasty. Traditor. He did not call it a Mongol dynasty that would have alienated the Chinese. He chose for it an abstract philosophical name drawn from the Book of Changes, Yi Jing, Yuan meaning origin, the primal beginning of the universe. With this step, Kublai wrote himself and his rule into the millennia-old tradition of Chinese dynasties. He was no longer merely a Mongol Khan ruling China. He became a Chinese emperor of the Yuan dynasty, the holder of the mandate of heaven. He united under his authority Mongol traditions and Chinese statecraft. His full temple name now sounded as Shizu, the dynastic founder, and he himself was the Emperor Shizu of the Yuan dynasty. Yet, to the Mongols, he would forever remain Kublai Sechin Khan Kublai the Wise. And now, having secured his power in the north, suppressed dissent in the steppe, and created a new state with a resplendent capital, Kublai turned his gaze south. The greatest and final task bequeathed by his grandfather still awaited its resolution. The Empire of the Southern Song, the jewel of Chinese civilization, a center of refined culture, science, and immeasurable wealth, still stood. Its conquest would become Kublai's greatest military triumph and would finally confirm him as the lord of all China. But it would also prove to be one of the most difficult and blood-soaked wars in history. So, we left Kublai in the year 1271, at the zenith of his power. He had won the civil war, declared himself emperor of the new Yuan dynasty, and founded the magnificent capital of Dadu. To the Mongols, he remained the great Khan. To the Chinese, he now stood as the son of heaven. And yet his greatest project, the work of his life, was not finished. South of the wide Yangtze, there still stood the Empire of the Southern Song, a surviving shard of China's ancient civilization, wealthy and cultured, but politically and militarily weakened. As long as it endured, Kublai could not claim to be the true ruler of all China. The conquest of the Southern Song was therefore not merely a campaign. It was the indispensable act of legitimizing his new dynasty in the eyes of millions. The Song, however fragile, were not an easy foe. This was not the open steppe where Mongol cavalry reigned. Southern China was a land of rivers, lakes, canals, mountains, and waterlogged rice paddies, a theater where fleet power and the art of siege decided wars far more than lightning raids on horseback. The Song were masters of fortification and possessed some of the most advanced military technologies of their time, including a broad array of gunpowder weapons, fire lances and flame projectors, incendiaries, and explosive bombs hurled from mechanical engines. Their fleets dominated the Yangtze and guarded the coasts. Kublai understood this perfectly. He refused to hurl his strength into a reckless assault. Preparation for the invasion took years. He built a navy of his own and retrained his forces, no longer purely Mongol, but now thick with northern Chinese, Yurkin, and Khitan contingents, to fight on water and in the punishing climate of the south. He stockpiled grain and timber, iron and rope, tar and sailcloth. He waited for the right opening. The key to the southern heartland was a pair of fortress cities on the Han River, a tributary of the Yangtze, Xiangyang and Fancheng. Twin citadels facing each other across the stream, they controlled the main gate to the interior. If they stood, an invasion army could not safely penetrate deeper into Song territory. And so, in 1268, the siege of Xiangyang began an ordeal that would become a 5-year blood-soaked drama, one of the most famous and stubborn struggles in military history. The Song garrisons fought with desperate courage. Supplies came upriver. Again and again, the Song fleet broke Mongol blockades and slipped food and reinforcements into the city. The Mongol siege engines, so effective against the mud-brick ramparts of Central Asia, proved inadequate before Xiangyang's stonework. The years dragged on. Kublai's armies bled and stalled. It seemed the southern enterprise had ground into a stalemate. Here Kublai displayed his greatest talent, pragmatic flexibility, and the ability to recruit the best minds from across his empire. He was no rigid traditionalist. When step methods failed, he sought others. He remembered how his brother Hulagu, during his Near Eastern campaigns, had cracked the mountain fortresses of the assassins. The secret lay in Persian engineers, masters of siegecraft. At Kublai's order, from Persia, out of the Ilkhanid realm, came two of the era's finest specialists, Ismail and Ala al-Din. With them, they brought a technology not yet seen in China on such a scale, the giant counterweight trebuchet. The Persians called them manjanik. The Chinese would name them hui hui pao, the Muslim catapult. These machines were wonders of engineering massive wooden frames, precision sling ropes, and great swinging counterweights. They could cast stone balls weighing hundreds of kilograms across astonishing distances with shattering accuracy. In 1273, beneath the walls of Fancheng, these new engines were assembled. Their effect was immediate and terrifying. The first stone, so the Chinese chronicle says, smashed into a city tower with a sound like breaking thunder. Under the relentless bombardment of these monsters, Fancheng's walls buckled and fell. The city was taken. Then, the full weight of the trebuchets turned upon Xiangyang. Its fate was sealed. Seeing the hopelessness of further resistance, the commander agreed to surrender in exchange for guarantees of safety for the inhabitants. Kublai kept his word. Thus ended the 5-year epic. The road south lay open. The fall of Xiangyang broke the Song's spine. Morale collapsed, and with it, the last illusions that the river line could hold forever. Kublai entrusted overall command of the army and fleet to one of his finest generals, a Mongol named Bayan. His name meant rich or great, the embodiment of the Mongol art of war, yet now operating within Kublai's new, more measured, more humane strategy. Bayan drove swiftly down the Yangtze, battering the Song navy, taking city after city. Many Song generals and officials, seeing the writing on the wall, crossed over to Yuan service. In 1276, Bayan's forces approached the southern Song capital, the splendid city of Linhai-Linyan, modern Hangzhou. Marco Polo, who may have seen it, called it Quinsai and described it as the greatest city on earth, a metropolis of perhaps 1 million souls, a center of trade, artistry, and luxury. But there was no longer a hand strong enough to rule it. Power had fallen to the Empress Dowager Xi, governing in the name of her young grandson, Emperor Gong. Panic and intrigue reigned at court. The chancellor fled. Resistance was futile. Empress Xi chose the wiser path, the one that saved millions. She surrendered the capital without a battle. Bayan entered Linen in triumph, but under Kublai's strict order there was no sack, no massacre. The child emperor, his mother, and the court were escorted with honor to Dudu. Kublai treated them with surprising mercy. He granted the former emperor a princely title, a residence, and stipends. Later, the boy, once the son of heaven, was sent to a Tibetan monastery to study Buddhism. He lived out his days far from worldly affairs. With that gesture, Kublai signaled to all under heaven that the mandate had passed finally and irrevocably to the Yuan. But not all China bowed, the staunchest Song loyalists. Two ministers, Zhang Shijie and Lu Shufu, fled the capital, carrying off two younger imperial princes. They proclaimed one of them a new emperor and raised a desperate resistance in the coastal provinces of Fujian and Guangdong. Their last refuge was the sea, a vast fleet crowded with the remnants of their armies and hundreds of thousands of refugees unwilling to yield to the Mongols. The final act of the tragedy unfolded in 1279, in the waters of Guangdong, the Battle of Yamen. It was among the largest naval clashes in world history. The enormous Song fleet, more than 1,000 ships, was trapped in the bay by Yuan forces superior in seamanship and logistics. Zhang Shiji made a fateful choice. He ordered the ships chained together in a long line, a floating fortress meant to break the enemy's will by endurance. The Yuan Admiral Zhang Hongfan sealed every exit from the bay, cutting the defenders off from fresh water and supplies. After weeks of blockade after thirst and hunger had sapped the last strength, he struck. Yuan ships advanced with fire throwers and siege engines mounted on decks. Flames leapt from hull to hull as the chained armada could not maneuver. Panic turned to slaughter. Seeing all was lost, Lu Shufu, to prevent the capture of the last emperor, took the 8-year-old boy in his arms and leapt with him into the sea from the flagship. Thousands of officials, soldiers, and court ladies followed his example. They chose death over the shame of capture. The bay was strewn with bodies. Yamen became a vast mass grave for the Song. Thus, in 1279, after more than 70 years of wars begun in Genghis Khan's day, all China, for the first time in 3 centuries, stood united under a single ruler. Kublai achieved what even his grandfather had not. He became lord of the Middle Kingdom in its entirety. Yet the conquest was the easier part. Now came the harder mandate to govern this immense, intricate, ancient civilization. Kublai's methods were pragmatic and controversial. He did not trust the Chinese elite, especially the southern literati steeped in Confucian tradition. He regarded them as a potential opposition, eloquent, learned, cohesive. To secure Mongol rule, he erected a rigid ethno-social hierarchy, dividing the empire's population into 4 broad categories. First, the Mongols. At the top stood the conquering minority. They formed the military and political elite, holding key commands in the army and senior posts in government. They were exempted from most taxes and adjudicated under their own laws. Second, the various peoples, Semuren, a privileged stratum of foreigners from the western and central reaches of the Mongol world, Persians and Arabs, Uyghurs and Turks, Syriac Christians, and even Europeans like Marco Polo. Kublai trusted them more than the Chinese because their power and welfare depended entirely on him. He placed them in crucial roles in the fiscal apparatus, in revenue administration, as engineers and managers. They served as a buffer between Mongols and the Chinese majority. Third, the Han people, Hanren. These were the inhabitants of the former Jin Empire in the north, as well as Khitan, Jurchen, and Koreans peoples longer under Mongol sway, considered more reliable than Southerners. Fourth, the Southerners, Nanren. At the bottom stood the former subjects of the Southern Song, around 60 million people, the vast majority of the realm. They bore the heaviest burdens, forbidden to bear arms or occupy high office, pressed by the harshest taxes. It was upon their backs that most of the empire's costs were loaded. This system had a single purpose: to ensure the control of a tiny Mongol minority over a vast Chinese majority. In the short term, it worked. In the long term, it planted a time bomb of resentments that would help bring the Yuan down a little over a century later. Even so, during Kublai's years, the unified realm enjoyed a relative peace and prosperity. The famed Pax Mongolica took hold. A single political horizon from Dadu to Persia and toward the borders of Hungary made the great route safer than they had been in memory. The Silk Road pulsed with new life. Merchants and missionaries, craftsmen and scholars traveled the width of Eurasia. Kublai promoted trade, enforced a unified system of paper currency throughout the country, repaired and extended the Grand Canal to feed the capital, and expanded the Yamen relay posts stone to stone, station to station, so that decrees and dispatches flew across the land with astonishing speed. His court at Dadu and his summer palace at Chengdu became cosmopolitan crossroads where one could meet people from every corner of the known world. At this high tide of power and splendor, the great Khan did not intend to rest. In his eyes, the mandate of heaven conferred the right and the duty to guide not only China, but the surrounding peoples as well. His gaze turned beyond the seas. By 1279, Kublai Khan had climbed to a summit his grandfather Genghis could only have dreamed of. All of China, from the Mongol grasslands to the shores of the South China Sea, lay at his feet. The Yuan Empire was a reality. The Pax Mongolica spread stability and prosperity across immense distances. It might have seemed the moment to sheath the sword and devote himself to peaceful governance. But in Kublai's veins ran the blood of a conqueror, and his imperial ideology, an alloy of the Mongol faith in a heavenly decree, and the Chinese concept of universal rule by the Son of Heaven, demanded more. It demanded that all peoples living beneath one sky acknowledge his supreme authority. Those who refused to submit willingly, he believed, must be compelled to do so by force. Kublai's gaze drifted beyond the Middle Kingdom, across the seas, toward lands bold enough to ignore his greatness. The final phase of his reign would be marked by a sequence of ambitious, ruinously expensive, and ultimately catastrophic overseas campaigns ventures that would strain his empire's economy and puncture the myth of his invincibility. His foremost target, his true obsession, became Japan. The land of the rising sun, separated from the continent by water, had never fit into China's tributary system the way Korea or Vietnam had. The Japanese regarded their own emperor as divine. They saw no reason to bow to anyone else. To Kublai, this was intolerable audacity. Beginning in 1266, he dispatched embassies demanding recognition of his suzerainty. The letters were composed in a lofty, imperious tone. They did not ask, they commanded. The ruler of a small country, Kublai wrote, has long sought to maintain friendly relations with neighbors. We exhort you to establish amicable relations, that we may live as one family. No one desires to resort to arms. The threat was veiled but unmistakable. In Japan, real power did not rest with the emperor in Kyoto, but with the Kamakura shogunate, dominated by the mighty Hojo regents, the warrior class. The samurai heard Kublai's message and burned with anger. They found the tone insulting. After long deliberations, they sent his envoys away empty-handed. Later embassies met the same icy reception. Some envoys were even executed in act that by any measure amounted to a direct declaration of war. Kublai's patience snapped. If diplomacy failed, he would let steel speak. In 1274, he assembled the first invasion armada, about 900 ships carrying some 40,000 warriors, Mongols, Yurkins, northern Chinese, and a large contingent of Koreans, for Korea had been turned into his forward base and bore the heaviest burden of fleet construction. The armada easily seized Tsushima and Iki, annihilating their small garrisons. Then, it put troops ashore in Hakata Bay on the north coast of Kyushu. The very first clash revealed a gulf in the practice of war. Japanese samurai favored ritualized single combats. A warrior would ride forward, announce his name, and challenge a worthy foe. The Mongol army moved as a single machine. advancing in dense ranks to the thunder of drums, showering the samurai with volleys from their powerful composite bows. They also wielded a terrible innovation, ceramic gunpowder bombs whose explosions boomed like thunder, terrified horses, and hurled shards of pottery as lethal shrapnel. The Japanese were forced back from the shore, suffering heavy losses. Defeat seemed imminent. But toward evening, the weather turned. Mongol commanders, fearing a storm would smash their fleet against the coast, pulled their troops back aboard to ride out the gale in open water. It was a fatal choice. During the night, a typhoon ripped into the bay. The small, flat-bottomed river, craft thrown together in haste for the invasion, were no match for the open sea. Wind and waves hurled hull against hull and dashed ships onto rocks. At dawn, the Great Armada was a field of wreckage. Roughly a third of the fleet was lost, thousands drowned. The demoralized survivors limped back to Korea. For the Japanese, it was a miracle. They believed their islands were shielded by the gods and named the saving storm Kamikaze, the divine wind. Kublai was furious at so humiliating a setback. He convinced himself that the failure sprang from bad weather and poor command, not Japanese strength. Yet, pressing affairs above all, the final conquest of the Southern Song drew his attention away for several years. Japan used the respite well. Expecting a greater invasion, the shogunate ordered a massive stone wall raised along Hakata Bay, several meters high, to thwart enemy cavalry landings. By 1281, Kublai, the ruler of all China, attempted a second invasion. This time, the scale was staggering, one of the largest naval operations in human history before the 20th century. He gathered two fleets. The Eastern Fleet, about 900 ships with 40,000 troops, again sailed from Korea. The main blow, however, would come from the Southern Fleet, assembled in the ports of newly conquered South China. Some 3,500 ships and over 100,000 soldiers and sailors, many of them former Song subjects. The plan was simple. The two fleets would rendezvous and crash down upon Kyushu. From the outset, everything went wrong. Coordination was poor. The Eastern Fleet reached Japan early, and without waiting for the main force, tried to land only to find the stone wall blocking every beachhead. Unable to deploy cavalry, the invaders were forced into exhausting fights for every yard of shoreline. The samurai, now seasoned and well-prepared, mounted daring night raids in small boats, torching Yuan ships and ambushing crews. For weeks the stalemate dragged on. By mid-August, the Southern Fleet finally arrived. A forest of masts, more than 4,000 ships filled the bay. From the shore, the defenders must have felt the end drawing near. To guard against further night attacks, Yuan commanders ordered many ships to be chained together, forming a floating camp. Then, the gods of Japan intervened again. On 15th of August 1281, a typhoon of unprecedented fury, the Great Kamikaze, swept across Kyushu. The chained ships became death traps, grinding and smashing each other, capsizing by the hundreds. Huge ocean-going junks of the Southern Fleet and smaller Korean vessels alike were dragged into a vortex of chaos and death. Chronicles say the debris was so thick that one could walk across the bay on wreckage. Losses were catastrophic. By some estimates, 70-90 of all personnel perished. Tens of thousands drowned or washed ashore, where samurai cut them down without mercy. Only a fraction of the armada escaped to the continent. The second expedition ended as one of the great naval disasters of history. Kublai was shaken. He wanted to gather a third armada, but the cost of the first two had been staggering, the human toll appalling. His counselors finally dissuaded him. The dream of subjugating Japan died. The double catastrophe dealt a crushing blow to Kublai's prestige. The myth of Mongol invincibility was gone, and Japan was not his only overseas ambition. With equal persistence and equal futility, he tried to bend Southeast Asia to his will. Jai Viet, northern Vietnam, and Champa, southern Vietnam. These campaigns had begun even before the fall of the Southern Song An attempt to open a second front. and continued afterward. Here, the Mongol army met a different enemy, not the sea, but the jungle. The sweltering, humid climate, tropical diseases such as malaria, and guerrilla tactics proved deadlier to steppe cavalry than the samurai had been. The Vietnamese were led by one of their greatest commanders, Tran Hung Giao. He avoided pitched battles on open ground, where the Mongols excelled. Instead, his forces struck from ambush, then dissolved back into forests and swamps. The Mongols captured and burned the capital Thang Long, modern Hanoi, more than once, but could not hold it. As soon as the main columns withdrew, Vietnamese forces returned. The most famous clash came in 1288 on the Bac Giang River. Knowing the heavy Yuan fleet would retreat downriver at low tide, Tran Hung Giao ordered iron-shod stakes driven into the riverbed. As the Yuan ships withdrew, they ran at speed onto the submerged field of spears. The fleet was wrecked. The defeat was total. After several such bloody and fruitless campaigns, Kublai had to abandon the conquest of Vietnam. Failure did not cure his ambition. In 1293, he sent a fleet to subdue Java. That expedition, too, unraveled. A local ruler cleverly used Yuan troops to crush his rivals, then turned on the Mongols themselves and drove them from the island. Campaigns against Burma brought down the ancient kingdom of Pagan, yet even there the Yuan failed to establish firm, lasting control. What did all these ventures mean? In a word, exhaustion. Building gigantic fleets, outfitting armies, and suffering terrible losses laid a crushing burden upon the economy borne above all by the southern Chinese taxpayers. The paper money that had initially held firm began to depreciate, the court issuing note after note to pay for war. Taxes climbed, grumbling spread. Worse, these defeats gnawed at Kublai's sacral authority. A son of heaven should not lose wars to barbarians. Setbacks abroad fed discontent at home. Confucian scholars, already sidelined, quietly rejoiced. To them it was proof that heaven did not favor a foreign ruler. In his final years, Kublai was no longer the energetic, fortunate sovereign of earlier days. Personal tragedies stalked him. In 1281, the very year of the Second Japanese disaster, his beloved wife and most trusted counselor, Empress Chabi, died. A Nestorian Christian by birth, wise and influential, she often softened her husband's anger and gave prudent advice. Her death struck Kublai to the core. 4 years later, in 1285, his eldest son and heir, Zhengjin, in the Mongol form Qingkim, also died. Kublai had groomed him carefully, giving him a superb Chinese education and preparing him to inherit the throne. The loss plunged the aging emperor into deep depression. He withdrew more and more from affairs of state and sought comfort in food. He grew corpulent, tormented by gout and other ailments. The great Khan, the conqueror of China, builder of the great capital, slowly became a sick, disillusioned old man, haunted by the ghosts of defeats and personal loss. The golden age of his rule gave way to twilight. The empire he had built still looked mighty and unbreakable, but beneath its glittering facade, the first cracks had already begun to show. We left the aging Kublai in his magnificent capital of Dadu, standing in the long shadow of grand triumphs and crushing defeats. His body was racked by illness, his spirit bent by personal tragedies and military failures. The final years of his life, from the late 1280s until his death in 1294, became a season of reckoning, a time when not only the greatness of his designs was evident, but also the deep structural contradictions laid into the very foundations of the empire he built. And to truly grasp Kublai's legacy, we must look at it from two sides like Janus, two-faced, gazing at once into past and future, west and east. On the one hand, the reign of Kublai is, without question, a golden age. The Mongol peace, in its distinctly Chinese expression, an era in which a vast stretch of Eurasia was bound together under a single sovereign as never before. The Silk Road, battered for centuries by war and fragmentation, became a safe, vibrant transcontinental artery. Caravans heavy with silk, porcelain, and spices rolled out of China toward the west. From Persia and Europe came goods in return: carpets, glassware, musical instruments, and most important of all, people and ideas. Kublai's court in Dadu was the most cosmopolitan place on earth. In this very age, the Venetian merchants, the father and uncle of Marco Polo, and then Marco himself, arrived in China. Polo's story, serving as he claimed at the Khan's court for 17 years, is the most famous, but by no means the only testimony to this exchange. Persian astronomers staffed the observatory he commissioned and devised a more accurate calendar. Arab engineers designed siege engines and hydraulic works. Uyghur scribes and administrators occupied important posts in the bureaucracy. Nestorian Christians from Syria and Armenians raised churches alongside Muslim mosques, Buddhist pagodas, and Taoist temples. The Franciscan monk Giovanni da Montecorvino would arrive in Dadu in the very year of Kublai's death and become the first Catholic Archbishop of Beijing, reporting to Rome on the striking religious toleration of the Mongol ruler. That toleration, in Kublai's case, was less a matter of humanitarian conviction than of supreme pragmatism. He understood that to govern a multi-confessional empire, one does not impose a single creed. One uses them all. He saw religions as instruments of rule. Personally, following the influence of his mother Sorghaghtani and his wife Chabi, he looked with sympathy upon Nestorian Christianity, yet his spiritual path led him toward Tibetan Buddhism. His mentors were the eminent Tibetan hierarch Sakya Pandita, and later, his nephew Phagpa Lama. Kublai effectively made Tibetan Buddhism the state religion, appointing Phagpa as imperial preceptor. He even charged him to create a new universal script for the whole empire, the so-called square script, Phagspa, intended to serve Mongolian, Chinese, Tibetan, and other tongues. The project never took root, but it reveals the scale of Kublai's thinking, his urge to forge a syncretic imperial culture. Within China itself, his achievements were no less impressive. Reunification of the country ended centuries of war between North and South. He completed the works on the Grand Canal, binding his northern capital to the rich rice-growing districts of the Yangtze Delta. That waterway became the circulatory system of the empire, ensuring steady provisioning of Dadu. He built out and perfected the Yamen relay post network, so that edicts and dispatches could travel at speeds of up to 400 kilometers a day, an unprecedented logistical breakthrough for the age. He instituted a unified paper currency, stimulating commerce across the land. Paradoxically, Kublai's reign proved a golden age for certain forms of Chinese arts. By pushing the Confucian scholar officials away from the highest tiers of administration, he inadvertently granted them freedom for creativity. Many learned men, barred from career advancement in government, turned to literature and theater. Under the Yuan, the popular dramatic form ancestor of later Chinese opera blossomed. These plays, written in the living vernacular rather than frozen classical prose, became beloved by city audiences. Many remain in the canon of Chinese literature to this day. And yet, on the reverse of this shining medal were carved the very causes of the dynasty's fall. The chief among them was the ethno-social hierarchy he created to rule China. Dividing the population into 4 estates: Mongols, Semuran, people of various categories, Ubaros, foreigners from the western and central Mongol domains, Hanrin, the northern Chinese under the former Jin, together with Khitan, Jurchen, and Koreans, and Nanrin, the southerners, the former subjects of the Song, was an effective instrument of control, but it was also a furnace of resentment. None felt more humiliated than the southerners, the erstwhile Song. They were the empire's most numerous and, in many respects, most cultured population yet, stood on the lowest rung of the social ladder. Such a system bred not loyalty but sullen resistance and dreams of revenge. The The second fatal mistake lay in economic policy. Grand projects, Dadu's monumental construction, the extension of the Grand Canal, and, above all, the catastrophic overseas wars in Japan and Southeast Asia, demanded colossal funds. To finance these costs, Kublai's government resorted to the simplest and most dangerous tool, the printing press. Unchecked emission of paper money, unbacked by real assets, led to galloping inflation. Prices rose, trust in the currency fell. At the same time, taxes climbed, falling heaviest upon the Chinese peasantry. The early prosperity gave way to crisis and the impoverishment of the masses. The third structural problem was the rejection of the traditional Chinese administrative system. By suspending the civil service examinations for years, Kublai shut down the primary social elevator for the Chinese intellectual elite. Distrusting the Confucian literati as disloyal, he preferred to rely on Mongol military aristocrats and foreign administrators. In doing so, he alienated the very class that, for centuries, had been the backbone of Chinese statehood. He deprived his dynasty of the support of those who could have supplied ideological legitimacy and effective local governance. Ultimately, all these problems condensed into a single, insoluble dilemma. Who was Kublai, the great Khan of the Mongols or the Emperor of China? He strove to be both, and in the end, became fully neither. To the steppe traditionalists, he was a turncoat upstart, the man who shifted the capital from sacred Karakoram to alien Dadu. To the majority of Chinese, despite his efforts to assume the mantle of the Son of Heaven, he remained a foreign conqueror, a barbarian upon the dragon throne. He built a hybrid empire. In the long run, that hybrid proved unsustainable. In February 1294, at the age of 78, after a long and painful illness, Kublai Khan died within his forbidden city in Dadu. He was buried in secret, according to Mongol custom, somewhere in the Khenti Mountains of northern Mongolia, near his great-grandfather. The site, like the tomb of Genghis Khan, has never been found. His successor was his grandson Timur, who reigned as Emperor Xiangyang. Capable and intent on continuing his grandfather's policies, Timur lacked Kublai's stature and authority. His heirs were weaker still. They sank ever deeper into the luxury of the Chinese court, losing the old Mongol martial edge, yet never winning the hearts of the Chinese people. The contradictions seeded under Kublai sharpened with each generation rapid successions, factional strife at court, economic crisis, natural disasters, and above all, a growing hatred of the foreign yoke. The empire was being hollowed out from within. In less than 75 years after Kublai's death, in the mid-15th century, a wave of popular uprisings swept China, the greatest of which was the Red Turban Rebellion. From their ranks emerged a new leader, a former peasant and Buddhist monk named Yuan. In 1368, his army captured Dadu. The last Yuan emperor fled back into the Mongol steppe. The dynasty that Kublai had founded with such splendor had fallen. Yuanzhang proclaimed the Ming, a new, fully Chinese dynasty. The circle had closed. So who, in the end, was Kublai Khan, destroyer or builder, barbarian or enlightened monarch? As so often in history, the answer lies somewhere in between. He was a man of transition, a giant standing with one foot in a nomad's yurt and the other in the throne hall of a Chinese emperor. He dismantled his grandfather's world empire, yet upon its ruins, he erected a unique civilization that, for a brief moment, became the center of the world. He unified China, though at the price of its subjugation. He opened east to west and west to east, setting in motion a global exchange whose ripples still touch us today. His legacy is more than the story of a single dynasty. It is a vast, tragic drama of cultural collision, an experiment in reconciling the irreconcilable. Saddle and throne, conquest and governance, the will of a singular genius and the soul of an ancient civilization. Kublai Khan was the last great Khan of the Mongols and the first emperor of the Yuan. And in that double title lies the essence of both his greatness and his tragedy. Thank you for watching.